one of the things that we briefly touched on was how supervision relates to therapist expertise and that sort of stuff. So what are your thoughts about that?
That is an interesting thing, and I think an important area. We ended up publishing an article in the American Psychologist in 2014 in which we took the stance that it's almost impossible as a therapist to become an expert. And we, without getting into all the nuances, the punchline really is that we don't as therapists get good immediate feedback on our work to be able to correct it and fine tune it. And the data show, by the way, that Simon Goldberg's done one of those studies. There's been another more recently from Europe showing that therapists tend not to get better over time without that extra, without those kinds of feedback options. And I think more recently, some discussion about deliberate practice. So that's really been a very interesting thread for me lately, and it's helped me think about competence, for example, because the zeitgeist right now in psychology is competence, and I think it's a good path. Competence-based training forces us to articulate our goals, like what are we working toward, how are we going to measure those, how are we going to hold each other accountable, all of those things that go with that. The data, though, don't support the therapist competence relates to treatment outcomes when you measure it by client improvement, which I think and people are often surprised to hear that. It's, oh my God, there's not a relationship, and there's some explanations for that we needn't get into, but it does lead to some interesting questions about if that's not the case, then what do we do next? And I think that's where that whole thread that Terry started around expertise comes to play, which is there's competence and then there's expertise. Competence is something that's agreed upon through consensus. So kind of the wise elders in our profession get together, they have discussions, and to some extent those are grounded in empirical work. But most of it's consensus of, this is an important competence. So it's about consensus, and in many respects, it's an aesthetic. It's kind of like in the Olympics grading ice skating, where at the end of the routine, the judges hold up a little number as a score. And I think competence has that same kind of quality. It's important. It's something to be striving toward. And I think when we're working with students, that's great. I think a next step then is working toward actual expertise. So that, again, if therapists tend to plateau pretty early in their careers, how do we get them off that plateau? And I think we don't have a good answer for that as a field. We don't have the structures in place to encourage it. I think it takes, a lot of hard work and a commitment that we don't have the structures in place to reinforce. I think the work on deliberate practice has been kind of an exciting development, but it's still new and kind of it's being worked out as to how it applies and should be used. But I think it's probably at the moment, our best avenue forward as we look toward expertise. But again, we just don't have the structures in place. It really relies on the people who have the most energy and commitment to developing their skills are the ones who are going to pursue that. And maybe those be the ones who would have done best anyway. So I think there's a confound of, self-selection.